Throughout the units of civil liberties in wartime, industrialization, labor, and social movements, the aspect of people using their voices as a power came to be known and are an important part of these topics. Through certain groups, their supporters, and powerful people with lots to say, the U.S. developed into a country willing to speak out. This showed existing issues throughout the society and helped to bring attention to them. From Clement Vallandigham to common people of the U.S., everyone's voices were heard during this time. During the unit of civil liberties in wartime, people started to exercise their right to speak out after the creation of the Sedition Act of 1798. This act declared that writing, publishing, or speaking of false, scandalous, or malicious nature against the government was punishable. Civil war and anti-war protests continued as people thought their rights were being taken away. These protests were partially fueled by two men, one named Clement Vallandigham. He spoke in the political rallies against Lincoln, telling people to vote him out of office. In one of his speeches, he said, "All power resides in the people, and is delegated always to be exercised for the advancement of the common weal by the express terms of the ordinance of the Constitution. Hence, any limits is dangerous to the liberties of the people." By saying this, he is saying that the people of the United States have all the power and they should use it to express their constitutional rights. If the government tries to stop it, that would be an intrusion of basic rights and could threaten basic liberties of people. Also, the people in the government should be the best and have the right to change the Constitution when they find it necessary. This caused over-criticism of the war after people thought about what Vallandigham was trying to get across. Another person of great importance was Debs. Eugene Debs, who was an important part of the civil liberties movement, was a socialist who pointed out that the war is unfair due to the fact that the lower classes and people who were forced to fight in the war weren't given any decision or say in whether to go to war. The specific point really resonated with people during this time. And then throughout the Sedition Act, people like Eugene Debs and Vallandigham spoke out to the best of their abilities in order to represent the people of America. This relates to how others spoke out during social movements and industrialization in the U.S. and connects all three of the units. People during the social movement spoke out for their rights, and during industrialization and labor, people spoke out against unfair working conditions. Throughout the social movements unit, there were three topics that greatly related to the aspect of speaking out. The New Left, women empowerment, and Black Power were all times where one can speak their mind. A movement called the New Left consisted of two groups, the Students for the Democratic Society, also known as SDS, and the Free Speech Movement. The SDS favored an equal society where wealthy people couldn't dictate laws. They held lots of protests and advocated for their new emerging society to be more equal. The FSM, Free Speech Movement, started after a protest at People's Park. This group also had protests that favored what the people wanted. These groups started the trend of people coming together in order to speak out, creating a bigger voice through many people. Another movement that also did this was the Black Power movement. During this time, people like MLK brought attention to the failure and violence in the system of the government and in daily life. This started the launch of bringing African Americans together to form groups advocating for rights and better treatment. Both the New Left movements and the Black Power movement showed existing issues throughout society, trying to bring attention to them. Women empowerment is the last movement that was very important in this time. Feminism started to become more and more popular as they fought for political rights, equal pay, and more economic opportunities. At the time, women received messages from society that they needed to be married and work at their house and take care of children. As time continued, more and more women wanted to break out of that barrier, especially Margaret Sanger, who spent most of her life striving to distribute information and services that would allow women to control their own bodies and lives. In one of her speeches, she wrote an inspiring message to people of the U.S. explaining the importance of the use of things like birth control and how women should be allowed to have their own rights and use it. In a speech, she advocated for birth control, saying, "We must not permit an increase in population that we are not prepared to care for to the best advantage, that we are not prepared to do justice to, educationally and economically. We must popularize birth control thinking." By saying this, Margaret is getting people to think about the importance of our future population and the fact that we can't care for a larger society. People's opinions that birth control would help stabilize this issue so that we could stay a stable society educationally and economically was now being heard. By saying this thing, she was putting at least out an idea to change society and representing women whose voices weren't heard. Throughout the unit of social movements, minorities and people whose voices were not heard got a chance to stand up for what they believed in and fight for change. This connects to industrialization and civil liberties, as they both focus on some people's opinions that aren't necessarily heard and giving them a voice. The interconnection between the three units also highlight how people spoke out. They were trying to get important issues in America noticed, which is what fuels these movements and protests. The way people spoke out largely represents our society and the way people were willing to fight for what they believe in and speak out. This is a lot about American people and how they like to exercise their freedom of speech. Unit 13 greatly relates to our units concerning civil liberties in wartime and social movements, due to the great amount of unions and groups formed during this time. During industrialization in the U.S., the start of unions began to form due to the unfair treatment of workers throughout the country. Specifically, the American Railway Union was a popular union that brought all members of the railroad together. One of the strikes, the Pullman strike, was protesting pay and treatment of people working for Pullman. Another important time people spoke out all stemmed from the Panic of 1873, when big businesses on the East Coast started to fail, so the pay of railroads workers got cut. This led to the first railroad strike. 14,000 workers blocked the trams and 100,040 people protested again in Pennsylvania, damaging property and burning buildings. This protest did not solve all the problems, but it brought attention to the problems concerning workers and pay. The Progressive Era, which supported fighting against unfair work conditions and treatment, started after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, when women who couldn't get out of a burning factory died due to the fact that the owners barred the windows and locked the doors so that they couldn't escape. Reformers started to fight against conditions of the factories and safety, rallying for more laws to make factories safer. Through all the unions in the Progressive Era, there was one individual who spoke out on behalf of the strikers, Benjamin Park DeWitt. Benjamin was a progressive movement activist who helped people understand the need for a new kind of political action that would address the issues of political corruption, expansion of political participation, and a greater role for government in a changing society. He caught people's attention in many of his speeches by the alarming tone one sang, to others who are willing to concede that the movement is not confined to a single leader. It represents the efforts of a small body of self-seeking politicians to gain position and influence by making capital of a movement that is temporarily popular. To others, the movement expresses the effort of a few sincere but misguided enthusiasts to carry out an impossible program of social reform that government and legislation made.